Life has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, doesn't it? You think everything's going great, you're living the life you always dreamed of, and then, out of nowhere, the rug gets yanked out from under you. That's exactly what happened to me. I thought I had a happy marriage, a beautiful family, and a pretty decent life. But as it turns out, I was living in a bubble that was about to burst in the most spectacularly painful way possible. My name's Tom, and I've been married to Claire for 12 years. We met in college, one of those whirlwind romances that everyone envies. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room with her smile, and I was the guy who was lucky enough to catch her eye. We got married right after graduation, and for a long time, life was pretty damn good. We built a life together, got decent jobs, bought a house, and eventually had 2 kids, Emma and Jack. If you had asked me a month ago, I would have told you I had everything I ever wanted. But then, things started to change. It was subtle at first. Claire became more distant, less interested in the little things that used to bring us together. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and inside jokes, became more about logistics and less about us. I noticed it, of course, but I chalked it up to the stress of raising kids and managing a household. We were both working full-time jobs, juggling schedules, dealing with the usual chaos of family life. I figured we were just in a rut, something that would pass once things settled down. But things didn't settle down. If anything, they got worse. Claire started going out more, girls' nights, she called them. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone needs a break, right? But these nights out became more frequent, and she'd come home later and later. She'd be distant the next day, irritable, like she was hungover, but she'd insist she wasn't. I tried to be understanding, to give her the space she seemed to need, but the more I gave, the more she pulled away. Our sex life, which had always been good, suddenly took a nosedive. She was always too tired, or not in the mood, or just plain uninterested. And when we did have sex, it felt mechanical, like she was just going through the motions. I started to wonder if it was me. Had I done something wrong? Was I not enough for her anymore? I tried talking to her about it, but she'd brush me off, say I was overthinking things, that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine, and deep down, I knew it. I noticed other things too. She started spending more time on her phone, always keeping it close, even taking it to the bathroom with her. She'd get these texts late at night, and when I'd ask who it was, she'd say it was one of the girls. But something didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like her to be so secretive. And then there were the sudden changes in her appearance. She started dressing up more, wearing makeup even when she didn't have anywhere to go. At first, I thought she was just trying to feel good about herself, but as time went on, it became clear that she wasn't doing it for me. The final straw came last week. I was getting ready for work, and Claire was already up, looking unusually put together for so early in the morning. She said she was meeting a friend for breakfast, which wasn't all that unusual, but something about the way she said it felt off. I didn't press her, just kissed her goodbye and left for work. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, she came home late again, claiming she had been out with her friend all day. But when I tried to ask her about it, she snapped at me, saying she didn't need to report every detail of her day to me. That's when I knew, something was definitely wrong. I started paying more attention, looking for signs, and it wasn't long before I found them. It was the little things at first, a receipt from a restaurant she never mentioned, a perfume on her that wasn't hers. Then I started noticing more obvious signs, texts she'd delete as soon as they came in, hushed phone calls when she thought I wasn't around. I could feel the walls closing in, the reality of what was happening slowly crushing me. But I wasn't ready to confront it, not yet. I wasn't ready to admit that the woman I loved, the mother of my children, might be cheating on me. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting. But the evidence kept piling up, and eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was going on, and it was time I found out exactly what it was. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Because as much as I wanted to pretend everything was fine, I knew deep down that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. You know that gut-wrenching feeling when you realize everything you thought was true is just a lie? That was the exact sensation that hit me like a freight train when I caught Claire with her boss. But let me start from the beginning of that hellish day. It was a Saturday morning, and Claire had left the house early, saying she was meeting some friends for brunch. By this point, my suspicions were in overdrive, and I wasn't going to let it slide. So, I decided to do something I never thought I'd have to do. I followed her. I waited about 10 minutes after she left, grabbed my jacket, and headed out. I didn't know exactly where she was going, but I knew the general direction. As I drove through town, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe I was wrong, maybe she really was meeting her friends. But that sliver of hope was quickly crushed and I spotted her car parked at the edge of the local park. She was supposed to be at a restaurant across town, so why the hell was she here? I parked a little way off and got out, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like a goddamn spy, sneaking around, trying to piece together the truth that I was so desperate to avoid. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and people walking their dogs. I walked quickly, scanning the area for any sign of Claire. My stomach twisted into knots, the dread building with every step I took. And then, there they were, Claire and her boss, Greg. Greg was everything I wasn't, tall, well-dressed, and oozing that corporate charm that made him a hit at office parties. I'd met him a few times before, never thinking much of him beyond the usual coworker interactions. But seeing them together now, in this context, everything clicked into place. The way she'd talk about him, the late-night texts that were work-related, the sudden need to dress up more often, it was all because of him. I hid behind a tree, feeling like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. I watched them for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. They were standing close, too close for just colleagues. He said something that made her laugh, and then, as if in slow motion, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't just a peck on the cheek, it was passionate, the kind of kiss that left no doubt about what was going on between them. My world shattered in that instant. Every emotion I'd been holding back, anger, betrayal, heartbreak, came flooding in all at once. But alongside those emotions came something else, cold, calculated rage. I wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, and started taking pictures. Click, click, click. Each photo felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. As I stood there, capturing their betrayal, the anger in me began to boil over. I was done being the passive husband, done with the lies, the deceit. I had proof now, and there was no way in hell I was going to let them get away with this. My heart pounded in my ears as I stepped out from behind the tree, phone still in hand. "Hey, Greg." I called out, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. They broke apart, both of them turning to face me with identical looks of shock and fear. Claire's eyes went wide, her face draining of color as she realized what I had just seen. "Tom," she gasped, stumbling back a step, but I didn't give her a chance to explain. "I should have known," I spat, glaring at Greg. "So this is why you've been so busy lately, huh? Screwing around in the park while I'm at home with the kids?" Greg had the audacity to look embarrassed, his hands going up in a weak attempt to placate me. "Tom, it's not what it looks like." But I wasn't in the mood for his bullshit excuses. My vision went red, and before I knew it, I was charging at him. My fist connected with his jaw with a satisfying crack, sending him stumbling backward. Claire screamed, but I barely heard her over the blood roaring in my ears. I hit him again, and again, each punch fueled by the months of suspicion, the late nights wondering what I'd done wrong, the sheer rage of having been made a fool of. Greg tried to fight back, but he was no match for the fury I unleashed on him. All I could think about was how this bastard had come into my life, into my marriage, and destroyed everything. It wasn't until I felt someone tugging on my arm that I realized Claire was pulling me back, screaming at me to stop. I shoved her off, panting, as Greg lay on the ground, groaning in pain. I wanted to keep going, to pound him into the dirt, but the reality of what I'd just done started to sink in. "Get out of here," I snarled at him. "Before I do something worse." Greg didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and took off, clutching his bleeding nose, leaving Claire and me standing in the middle of the park. I was still breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through my veins, but the initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, heavy sadness. Claire was crying, her face streaked with tears as she reached out to me. "Tom, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, my voice hollow. "Just don't." I couldn't even look at her. The woman I loved, the mother of my children, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And now, all I had left were the shattered pieces of the life we'd built together. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving Claire sobbing in the park. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to get as far away from her as possible. The pain in my chest was unbearable, but I kept walking, trying to figure out how the hell I was supposed to pick up the pieces of my broken heart. I don't know how long I wandered around after leaving Claire in the park. The adrenaline from beating Greg had worn off, leaving me feeling drained and hollow. My mind was a chaotic mess of anger, hurt, and disbelief. I couldn't wrap my head around what had just happened, how everything I thought I knew about my life had been ripped apart in an instant. Eventually, I found myself back in my car, sitting there in stunned silence. The photos I'd taken were still on my phone, evidence of the betrayal that had blown my world apart. I couldn't even bring myself to look at them again. The reality was seared into my brain, playing on a loop that I couldn't escape from. For a moment, I considered not going home. The idea of facing Claire, of having to talk about what had happened, was unbearable. But as much as I wanted to run, I knew I couldn't. I had to confront her, to hear whatever pathetic excuses she was going to offer, and maybe, just maybe, get some kind of closure. I started the car and drove home, each mile feeling heavier than the last. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself before heading inside. The house was quiet when I walked in, too quiet. The kids were staying with my parents for the weekend, thank God, so I didn't have to worry about them hearing the inevitable explosion that was coming. I shut the door behind me and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. Before I heard it, the sound of Claire sobbing in the living room. I walked in to find her sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Tom," she choked out, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry." Save it," I cut her off, my voice cold. I wasn't in the mood for her apologies, not after what I'd just seen. "I don't want to hear your excuses." She flinched at my words, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, just let me explain," she begged, but I shook my head, refusing to let her manipulate me with her tears. "Explain what, Claire?" I snapped, the anger bubbling back up to the surface. "Explain how you've been screwing your boss behind my back. How you've been lying to me, to our kids. There's nothing you can say that'll make this right." She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. It just got out of control." "Got out of control?" I echoed, my voice rising. "This wasn't some accident, Claire. You made a choice. You chose to cheat, to betray me, to destroy our marriage. And for what? For that asshole?" She shook her head frantically, stepping closer to me. "No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't serious, I swear. It was just, I don't know, a stupid mistake. A moment of weakness." I scoffed, taking a step back to put some distance between us. "A moment of weakness? You call months of lying and sneaking around a moment of weakness? How long has this been going on, Claire? How long have you been screwing him?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor as if she couldn't bear to look at me. 6 months, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But it didn't mean anything, Tom. I swear, it didn't mean anything. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. 6 months. 6 months of lies, of betrayal, of her smiling in my face while she was sleeping with another man. The rage surged back, hotter and more intense than before. Didn't mean anything? I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. It meant enough for you to keep doing it for half a fucking year. I know, she sobbed, reaching out to me, but I slapped her hand away, unable to bear her touch. I know I've hurt you, Tom. I know I've destroyed everything, but please, please don't give up on us. Us? I laughed bitterly. There is no us, Claire. You killed that the moment you decided to fuck him. Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. Part of me wanted to feel pity for her, but all I could muster was a cold, detached numbness. This was the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd planned to spend the rest of my life with, and now I couldn't even look at her without feeling sick. I paced the room, trying to process everything, but it was impossible. The pain was too raw, too overwhelming. Why, Claire? I demanded, turning to face her. Why the hell did you do it? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt and shame. I don't know, she whispered. I was lonely, I guess. You were always so busy with work, with the kids, and I felt invisible. And then Greg, he made me feel wanted, like I mattered. I shook my head, disgusted by her excuses. So this is my fault now? I wasn't paying enough attention to you, so you had to go find someone else to make you feel special? No, that's not what I'm saying, she cried, trying to explain herself. I'm just trying to make you understand. Understand? I interrupted, my voice rising. How the hell am I supposed to understand that you threw away everything we had for some cheap affair? You could have talked to me, Claire. You could have told me you were feeling this way, but instead, you decided to fuck another man. I know, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands again. I was stupid, I was selfish, and I hate myself for it. But please, Tom, please don't leave. I love you, and I don't want to lose you. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of her words pulling me under. Love. How could she claim to love me after what she'd done? How could she expect me to believe that after all the lies? You don't love me, I said, my voice cold and hard. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have betrayed me like this. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. That's not true. I do love you, Tom. I love you more than anything. Stop lying. I yelled, the fury taking over again. Just stop fucking lying. You love me? You love me so much that you've been fucking your boss for 6 months? You love me so much that you destroyed our family, our marriage? I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it, Claire, I said, my voice dripping with bitterness. Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done. She looked up at me, desperation in her eyes. Please, Tom, I'll do anything. I'll go to counseling, I'll quit my job, whatever it takes. Just don't leave me. Don't leave our family. I stared at her, the woman I once loved more than anything, and felt nothing but contempt. How could she sit there and beg me to stay after everything she'd done? After the lies, the betrayal, the months of deceit? I'm not leaving, I said finally, my voice calm but icy. But not for you, Claire. I'm staying because of the kids. They don't deserve to have their lives ripped apart because of your bullshit. She looked relieved for a moment, but I wasn't done. But don't think for a second that this means I'm forgiving you. We're not just going to sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened. You need to understand something. What you did, it changed everything. I don't know if we can come back from this, and honestly, I don't know if I even want to try. Her relief vanished, replaced by a look of sheer devastation. Tom, please, she whispered, but I cut her off again. "No, Claire," I said, my voice firm. "You don't get to make demands. You don't get to cry and beg for forgiveness like it's that easy. You've destroyed our marriage, and I'm not sure if I can ever look at you the same way again. I'm staying for the kids, but don't think for a second that things will go back to the way they were." She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered, but I wasn't sure she did. I wasn't sure she could comprehend the depth of the damage she'd done. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the living room, leaving Claire alone with her tears. I headed upstairs to our bedroom, no, my bedroom now, and slammed the door behind me. I needed to be alone, to think, to try to figure out how the hell I was going to survive this nightmare. I lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. The anger was still there, simmering just below the surface, but now it was joined by something else, pain. A deep, aching pain that threatened to consume me. Claire's betrayal had cut me to the core, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to heal from it. The weight of what had happened settled over me like a suffocating blanket, and for the first time since I'd caught them in the park, I let myself cry. The tears came slowly at first, but soon I was sobbing uncontrollably, the reality of my shattered life crashing down around me. I don't know how long I lay there, crying into the silence of the room. But when the tears finally stopped, I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. Claire had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and there was no going back from that. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let her walk all over me anymore. If she thought she could just cry and beg her way out of this, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't running away from this fight. No, I was going to stay, and I was going to make sure Claire understood exactly what she'd done. She was going to feel every ounce of the pain she'd caused me, and I was going to make damn sure she never forgot it. The days following that explosive confrontation were tense, to say the least. I had made my stance clear, I was staying for the kids, not for Claire. But living under the same roof with her after everything that had happened was like walking through a minefield. Every interaction was charged with unspoken resentment, and the atmosphere in the house was thick with the weight of our unresolved pain. Claire, for her part, seemed desperate to prove she could change, to somehow make up for what she had done. She became overly attentive, going out of her way to do things she thought would please me, cooking my favorite meals, keeping the house spotless, even being extra affectionate with the kids. It was like she was trying to turn back the clock, pretending that we could somehow return to the way things were before her affair. But I wasn't having it. Every time she tried to be sweet or caring, it just made me angrier. How dare she act like the perfect wife now, after everything she'd done? It felt like she was mocking me, rubbing salt in the wound she'd created. And every time she looked at me with those pleading, tear-filled eyes, I was reminded of the fact that she had shared herself with another man. The thought of her and Greg together still made my blood boil. I knew that I couldn't just let her off the hook. There was a part of me that wanted to see her suffer, to feel even a fraction of the pain and humiliation that I was enduring. If she thought she could just cry her way back into my good graces, she was sorely mistaken. She needed to understand the gravity of her betrayal, and I was going to make sure she did. The first step in my plan was simple: distance. I refused to share a bed with her. I moved into the guest room, and every night, I made it a point to lock the door behind me. If she wanted to be with someone, she could have the bed all to herself. The message was clear: I wasn't her husband anymore, not in any meaningful sense. But that was just the beginning. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Claire approached me in the living room, her face etched with that familiar look of guilt and desperation. She sat down next to me on the couch, a little too close for my liking, and I immediately tensed up. "Tom, can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. I didn't look at her, keeping my eyes fixed on the TV. "What do you want to talk about?" She hesitated, wringing her hands in her lap. I want to know where we stand. I want to know if there's any chance for us to work through this, to fix what's broken." I felt a surge of anger at her words. How could she even ask that after everything she'd done? But I kept my voice calm, detached. There's nothing to fix, Claire. You broke it beyond repair. Her face crumpled, but she pressed on. I know I hurt you, Tom. I know I destroyed your trust, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Please, just give me a chance. I finally turned to look at her, my expression cold and unyielding. You think this is something you can just make right with a few apologies and good behavior? You think a little bit of extra effort around the house is going to erase what you did? She shook her head frantically. No, that's not what I'm saying. I know it's not that simple. But I love you, Tom. I love you, and I want to fight for us, for our family. I laughed bitterly. You've got a funny way of showing love, Claire. Most people don't cheat on the ones they love. She flinched as if I'd slapped her, but I didn't let up. You want to know where we stand? Fine. Here's the truth, you're not my wife anymore. You lost that title the moment you spread your legs for someone else. You're just the mother of my kids now, nothing more. She gasped, her eyes welling up with tears. Tom, please, don't say that. We've been through so much together. We can get through this too. But I wasn't done. I stood up, towering over her, and leaned in close, my voice low and venomous. You think I'm just going to forgive and forget? You think I'm going to let you waltz back into my life like nothing happened? No, Claire, you're going to pay for what you did. You're going to feel every ounce of the pain you caused me. She stared up at me, her face pale, her lips trembling. What do you mean? I straightened up, looking down at her with cold disdain. It means that every time you try to make things right, I'm going to remind you of what you did. Every time you think we're making progress, I'm going to knock you back down. You're going to live with this, Claire. You're going to live with the fact that you destroyed our marriage, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. Her tears flowed freely now, but I felt nothing, no pity, no sympathy. She had brought this on herself, and she deserved every bit of it. The next few days were a nightmare for Claire. I made sure of that. I began to pick apart every little thing she did, finding fault with her every move. If she cooked dinner, I'd complain about how it tasted. If she cleaned the house, I'd point out the spots she missed. I criticized her appearance, her parenting, even the way she spoke. Nothing was off limits. I wanted her to feel as worthless as she had made me feel. And when she tried to stand up for herself, to argue or defend her actions, I'd throw the affair back in her face. You think I care about what you have to say? I'd snap. You lost the right to have an opinion when you decided to fuck Greg. The worst part was, I could see that it was working. Claire was crumbling under the weight of my relentless attacks. She started avoiding me, retreating into herself, but that only made me push harder. I wanted her to break. I wanted her to feel every bit of the pain she had caused me, to understand that there was no going back to the way things were. One night, after another particularly vicious argument, I found her sitting in the darkened kitchen, her face buried in her hands. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I could see her shoulders shaking, hear the quiet sobs she was trying to stifle. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something, regret, maybe? But it was quickly swallowed by the cold, hard resolve I had cultivated over the past few weeks. She needed to understand the depth of her betrayal, and if this was what it took, then so be it. I sat down across from her, watching as she tried to compose herself. You think crying is going to make me forgive you? I asked, my voice flat and emotionless. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red. No, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't take this. Can't take what, Claire? I asked, my tone mocking. Can't take being reminded of the mess you made? Can't take the consequences of your actions? She didn't answer, just shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You brought this on yourself, I continued, leaning back in my chair. You knew what you were doing. You knew what it would cost. And now, you're going to live with it. This is your life now, Claire. This is our life. You destroyed everything, and there's no going back. She looked at me, her expression one of utter defeat. I know, she said quietly. I know I deserve this. I know I deserve all the pain you're giving me. But Tom, it's killing me. I don't know how much more I can take. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, guilt, maybe? But it was quickly buried under the cold satisfaction of knowing that she was finally feeling the pain she had caused me. You should have thought about that before you spread your legs for Greg, I said coldly, standing up from the table. Maybe if you had, we wouldn't be in this mess. She didn't respond, just sat there in silence, her tears falling onto the table. I watched her for a moment longer before turning and leaving the kitchen. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything. Just a hollow emptiness that I couldn't shake. The days dragged on, each one a repeat of the last. Claire continued her desperate attempts to make things right, but I made sure to crush every single one. The more she tried, the more I pushed her away. I could see the toll it was taking on her, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched whenever I spoke, the way her once vibrant personality had withered into a shadow of its former self. But despite it all, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I was consumed by the need to make her pay, to make her suffer as I had suffered. I didn't care if it destroyed her. Hell, I wanted it to. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal every single day, to know that there was no escape from the consequences of her actions. It wasn't until one evening, when I found her curled up on the bathroom floor, sobbing uncontrollably, that I finally realized how far I had gone. She looked up at me with such despair in her eyes that it nearly broke through the walls I had built around myself. Please, she begged, her voice barely a whisper. Please, Tom, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything, just please stop. For a moment, I just stood there, staring down at her, my heart pounding in my chest. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To break her, to make her feel the pain I had felt? But as I looked into her tear-streaked face, the anger that had driven me for so long started to crumble. What was I doing? What had I become? I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. The satisfaction I had once felt was gone, replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. Claire had destroyed our marriage, but in my quest for revenge, I had destroyed the both of us. Realizing the extent of the damage I had caused was a bitter pill to swallow, but it didn't erase the fury I still harbored for Greg. Every time I thought about him, my blood would start boiling all over again. He had taken something from me, something sacred, and I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. Claire was suffering, but it wasn't enough. Greg needed to feel the pain too, and I was going to make damn sure he did. I started by doing some research. I knew the basics about Greg, where he worked, what kind of car he drove, even where he lived, thanks to the few office parties Claire had dragged me to over the years. But I needed more than just basic information if I was going to hit him where it hurt. So I dug deeper, using every resource I could find to piece together a full picture of his life. It turned out that Greg wasn't as squeaky clean as he appeared to be. Sure, he had the high-paying job and the nice house, but he also had some skeletons in his closet. He had a history of gambling, which wasn't public knowledge, but a few discreet inquiries pointed me to some substantial debts he'd accumulated over the years. More importantly, I found out that he had a wife, a woman named Linda who was blissfully unaware of his extramarital activities. Perfect. The first step in my plan was to gather more evidence. The photos I had taken in the park were a good start, but I needed more, something that would leave no room for denial. I decided to follow Greg, just like I had followed Claire. It didn't take long to figure out his routine. He was nothing if not predictable. He left work at the same time every day, usually heading to a nearby bar before going home. I followed him several times, watching from a distance as he flirted with the bartender, sometimes even bringing her out for a drink after her shift ended. It was clear that Claire wasn't the only woman he was fooling around with. After a week of tailing him, I had enough dirt to bury him. Photos, videos, text messages, I had it all. But I wasn't just going to confront him and be done with it. No, I was going to dismantle his life piece by piece, just like he had done to mine. My first move was to contact Linda. I waited until I knew Greg would be at work, then called her from a burner phone. When she picked up, I could hear the confusion in her voice. "Hello," she answered, sounding cautious. "Linda?" I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "My name is Tom. I think you need to know what your husband has been up to." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her heart start racing on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "I'm talking about Greg," I said bluntly. "I've got proof that he's been cheating on you. Not just with one woman, but several. If you want to see the evidence, I'm willing to show you." Another silence. I could tell she was trying to process what I was saying, but the disbelief was obvious. "This must be some kind of mistake," she said, though there was no conviction in her words. "It's not a mistake," I replied. "I've got photos, videos, and text messages that prove everything. If you want to see them, I can meet you somewhere." There was a shaky exhale on her end, and I knew she was teetering on the edge of shock and devastation. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because your husband ruined my marriage," I said, the anger simmering beneath my calm tone. "And I think you deserve to know the truth." Linda was silent for a long moment before she finally agreed to meet me. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop the next day, far enough from both our homes that we wouldn't be recognized. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I spotted Linda immediately. She was sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee, her eyes staring blankly at the table in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept all night, and I felt a twinge of guilt for what I was about to do. But that guilt was quickly overshadowed by the image of Greg and Claire in the park, locked in that passionate kiss. He deserved this, and so did she. I walked over to the table, and she looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and full of uncertainty. "Tom?" she asked, her voice small and strained. I nodded and sat down across from her. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, keeping my tone as gentle as I could. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with those big, wounded eyes, waiting for me to drop the bomb. I took a deep breath and pulled out the envelope I had prepared, sliding it across the table to her. "This is everything," I said quietly. "Photos, texts, everything you need to know about what Greg has been doing behind your back." She hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling as she reached for the envelope. When she finally opened it and started going through the contents, I watched as her face crumpled in horror. The photos of Greg with Claire, the videos of him with the bartender, the explicit text messages, it was all there, laid out in stark detail. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I can't believe this. How could he do this to me?" "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I know this is a lot to take in. But I thought you deserved to know the truth." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "What am I supposed to do now?" "That's up to you," I replied. "But if I were you, I'd make sure Greg pays for what he's done." Linda stared at the photos in disbelief, the reality of her husband's betrayal sinking in. She looked lost, broken, just like I had felt when I first discovered what was going on between Claire and Greg. But she was stronger than she looked. I could see it in the way she squared her shoulders, wiped her tears, and took a deep, steadying breath. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice wavering but determined. "I'll deal with Greg. He's going to regret this." I nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction in knowing that Greg's life was about to implode. "He should," I said, standing up to leave. "And if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Linda nodded, but her focus was already on the evidence in front of her, her mind likely racing with thoughts of how she was going to confront her husband. I left the coffee shop, feeling a sense of closure as I walked back to my car. Greg's world was about to come crashing down, and I was more than happy to have been the one to light the fuse. But that was only the beginning. I wasn't satisfied with just exposing him to his wife. No, I wanted to make sure Greg felt the consequences of his actions in every aspect of his life. He had destroyed mine, so it was only fair that I returned the favor. I knew that Greg's job was everything to him. He was one of those guys who lived for his career, climbing the corporate ladder, and basking in the recognition that came with it. So, I made it my mission to tear that down too. The next step in my plan was to send the evidence to Greg's employer. I waited until I knew he'd be out of the office, then mailed the package directly to his boss, including a detailed account of Greg's inappropriate behavior with female employees, backed up by the photos and messages I had collected. I knew that in a company like his, appearances were everything. They wouldn't tolerate an executive who was embroiled in a scandal like this, especially one that involved workplace affairs. I didn't have to wait long to see the fallout. Within a week, word got around that Greg had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his conduct. The company was trying to keep it quiet, but gossip spreads like wildfire, and soon enough, everyone knew what was going on. His reputation was in tatters, and his career was hanging by a thread. But even that wasn't enough. Greg had made my life a living hell, and I wanted him to feel every bit of that agony. So, I made sure the news of his indiscretions reached everyone in our social circle. Friends, acquaintances, even his neighbors, no one was spared. I didn't need to say much, the evidence spoke for itself. People were shocked, appalled, and Greg quickly found himself isolated, abandoned by the very people he had once called friends. It wasn't long before Linda kicked him out of their house. I heard through the grapevine that she had filed for divorce, citing infidelity as the cause. Greg's world was crumbling, just as mine had, and I relished every moment of it. But even as I watched Greg's life unravel, there was a hollow emptiness inside me that wouldn't go away. I had gotten my revenge, and yet, it didn't bring the satisfaction I had hoped for. Sure, I had destroyed the man who had ruined my marriage, but in the process, I had destroyed a part of myself too. I realized that no amount of revenge could ever truly heal the wounds that Claire and Greg had inflicted on me. The anger that had driven me for so long was starting to burn out, leaving behind nothing but a cold, empty void. I had won, but the victory was hollow. The truth was, no amount of retribution could undo the betrayal, the loss, the pain. As I sat alone in my car, staring at the photos I had taken of Greg and Claire in the park, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The revenge, the anger, the plotting, it had all taken its toll. I was tired. Tired of being consumed by hatred, tired of reliving the betrayal, tired of the person I had become. But there was one thing left to do, one final step that I had been avoiding. I needed to talk to Claire, to face the future that now seemed so uncertain, and to decide where we went from here. The time for revenge was over. Now, it was time to confront the reality of our shattered lives and figure out what came next. In the days following my final act of revenge against Greg, I found myself confronting the cold reality of what my life had become. I had torn down the man who had ruined my marriage, but I still felt empty, directionless. It was as if I had been running on adrenaline and anger for so long that now, without them fueling me, I was left with nothing but the stark, painful truth: my marriage was over, and there was no fixing what had been broken. The decision to file for divorce wasn't an easy one, but it was the only choice that made sense. Every time I looked at Claire, all I could see was the betrayal, the lies, the months she spent sneaking around behind my back. No matter how much she cried, how many apologies she offered, the damage was too deep, the trust too shattered. We were beyond saving. I contacted a lawyer, a tough, no-nonsense woman named Karen who had a reputation for getting things done quickly and efficiently. I wasn't interested in dragging this out any longer than necessary. I just wanted to move on, to start rebuilding my life without the constant reminder of Claire's infidelity hanging over me. When I met with Karen, I laid out the situation as plainly as I could. I told her about the affair, the evidence I had gathered, and my decision to leave. I expected her to encourage me to go for everything I could, to fight for the house, for custody of the kids, to make Claire pay for what she had done. But instead, Karen just listened quietly, nodding as I spoke, and then she surprised me. "You have every right to go after her for what she did," Karen said, her tone calm but firm. "But I get the sense that's not what you want." I frowned, unsure of where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Tom, I've seen a lot of divorces, and I've seen a lot of people make decisions out of anger and hurt. They go for the jugular, thinking it'll make them feel better, but in the end, it usually just drags them down even further. From what you've told me, it sounds like you've already done your share of getting back at Claire and Greg. But now, you need to think about what's best for you, and for your kids." I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. I had spent so much time consumed by anger, driven by the need to make them both pay, that I hadn't stopped to think about what would come next, about what I really wanted out of this divorce. "What do you suggest?" I asked quietly, the anger that had driven me for so long now feeling distant, almost foreign. Karen smiled slightly, a kind but knowing expression on her face. "That depends on what you want, Tom. You said you're done with the marriage, that there's no fixing it. If that's the case, then you need to think about how to move forward with as little collateral damage as possible. You've got 2 kids who still need stability, and you've got a wife who, despite everything, probably isn't going to make things easy." I nodded slowly, the pieces starting to fall into place in my mind. "I don't want to drag this out," I admitted. "I just want it to be over. I don't care about the house, or the money, or anything else. I just want my kids to be okay." Karen nodded in understanding. "In that case, we can approach this with the goal of minimizing conflict. You can choose to leave the house to Claire, keep things as stable as possible for the kids, and negotiate a fair custody arrangement. It doesn't have to be a battle, Tom. It can be a clean break." I thought about it for a long moment, the idea of leaving everything behind, the house, the memories, even the kids, feeling both painful and oddly liberating. But Karen was right. My kids needed stability, and as much as I wanted to protect them, I knew that dragging them through a bitter custody fight would only hurt them more. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steady. "Let's do it. I'll leave Claire the house and the kids. I just want to make sure I still get to see them, that they know I'm not abandoning them." Karen nodded. "We'll make sure you get joint custody, with regular visitation. It'll be fair and in the best interest of your children. And I'll make sure the process is as quick and painless as possible." I left Karen's office that day feeling a sense of finality, but also a strange sense of peace. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. It was time to face Claire and make it official. When I got home, Claire was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something on the stove. She looked up as I walked in, her face a mix of hope and fear. She had been trying so hard to make things right, to win me back, but it was too late. The walls between us were too high, too thick, and I couldn't see any way to break them down. "Tom," she said softly, setting down the spoon. "Can we talk?" I nodded, knowing this conversation had been inevitable. "We need to," I agreed. We sat down at the kitchen table, the place where so many of our conversations had taken place over the years. But this time, the air was thick with tension, with the weight of what we both knew was coming. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," I began, keeping my voice calm and measured. "About us, about what happened, and about where we go from here." She nodded, her eyes searching mine for some hint of what I was going to say. "And," she prompted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm filing for divorce," I said bluntly, watching as the color drained from her face. "It's the only option that makes sense now. We're beyond repair, Claire. I can't keep living like this, and I don't think you can either." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to keep herself together. "I know I hurt you, Tom," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I destroyed everything, but I never wanted this. I never wanted to lose you." "It's not about what you wanted, Claire," I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. "It's about what you did. You made choices that I can't forgive, and now we have to live with the consequences. I'm not doing this to punish you, I just can't stay in a marriage that's built on lies." She nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. "But what about the kids? What's going to happen to them?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was the hardest part, but it was also the most important. "I'm leaving you the house," I said, watching as surprise flickered across her face. "I want the kids to have as much stability as possible. I'll move out, but I want joint custody. I'll see them regularly, and I'll be there for them as much as I can. But they need you too, and they need a home that doesn't remind them of all the fighting." She stared at me, a mix of relief and sadness in her eyes. "You're really leaving?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I have to," I said quietly. "We can't keep living like this, Claire. It's not good for us, and it's not good for the kids. I'll always be their father, and I'll always be there for them, but I can't stay here anymore." For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything we had lost hanging between us. Claire was crying, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I had done my share of crying, and now it was her turn to face the reality of what we had become. "I'll make sure the lawyer drafts up the papers," I said finally, my voice distant. "We'll work out the details of custody, and I'll move out as soon as possible. I think it's best if we make this as quick and painless as we can, for everyone's sake." She nodded, wiping her tears, her face a mask of resignation. "I understand," she said softly. "I'm sorry, Tom. I'm so sorry." But her apologies meant nothing to me now. The damage was done, and no amount of sorry could undo what she had done. The life we had built together, the dreams we had shared, all of it had crumbled into dust. And now, it was time to walk away from the ruins and try to rebuild something new, something better, for the sake of our children. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, packing, and trying to explain to Emma and Jack what was happening. Telling them that their parents were getting a divorce was the hardest conversation I had ever had. Their little faces, full of confusion and sadness, tore at my heart, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I promised them that I would always be there for them, that nothing would change between us, even if I wasn't living in the same house anymore. The day I moved out was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. The house that had once been filled with laughter, with love, now felt like a tomb, a place where happiness had died. I packed my things in silence, with Claire avoiding my gaze, and the kids clinging to me, begging me not to go. But I knew that staying would only prolong the pain, for all of us. As I drove away from the house, my heart heavy with the weight of what I was leaving behind, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The chapter of my life with Claire was over, and while the future was uncertain, it was also a blank slate, a chance to start fresh, to find happiness again, on my own terms. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least it was mine to walk. And as I looked at the photos of Emma and Jack that I had taped to the dashboard of my car, I knew that I would do whatever it took to be the father they needed, even if it meant letting go of the life I had once dreamed of. After moving out of the house, I found myself in a small, modest apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a place to sleep and store my things, but it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but it was a start. A blank slate, like my life had become. I had left behind the house, the memories, and the daily reminders of Claire's betrayal. But in exchange, I had gained a small measure of peace, a space where I could begin to heal. The first few days were rough. The silence was deafening, and I found myself reaching for my phone out of habit, almost expecting a text from Claire asking when I'd be home. But there were no texts, no calls, nothing. The reality of our separation hit me harder than I had expected. I had known this was coming, had prepared myself for it, but living it was something else entirely. There were moments when the loneliness was unbearable, and I had to remind myself that this was better than the constant anger, the constant pain of living with someone who had shattered my trust. The kids were my lifeline during those first weeks. I had them every other weekend and a few evenings during the week, and those were the times when I felt most like myself again. Emma and Jack were resilient, stronger than I had given them credit for. They adjusted to the new arrangement better than I had expected, but I could still see the confusion and sadness in their eyes whenever I dropped them back off at Claire's. They were trying to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down, and all I could do was be there for them, to reassure them that no matter what, I would always be their dad. One evening, after dropping the kids off, I found myself driving aimlessly around town. The streets were quiet, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. I didn't have a destination in mind, I just needed to clear my head, to escape the emptiness of my apartment for a little while. As I drove, I thought about everything that had happened, about the man I had been before Claire's affair and the man I was trying to become now. I had spent so much time focused on the past, on revenge, on anger, on the pain of betrayal, that I had lost sight of the future. But now, with the divorce finalized and my life moving in a new direction, I had to start thinking about what came next. I had to start thinking about who I wanted to be, not just for myself, but for my kids. They needed a father who was present, who was strong, who could show them that life goes on, even after everything falls apart. As I drove through the familiar streets, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a small park on the edge of town. It was the same park where I had caught Claire and Greg together, the place where my life had come crashing down. I hadn't been back since that day, hadn't wanted to face the memories that were tied to this place. But now, as I sat in my car, staring out at the darkened park, I realized that I needed to confront those memories if I was ever going to move forward. I got out of the car and walked slowly through the park, the cool night air wrapping around me like a blanket. The park was empty, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the trees and the distant hum of traffic. I made my way to the bench where I had first seen them, where I had taken the photos that had set everything in motion. The bench was empty now, just a piece of cold metal in the fading light, but standing there brought everything rushing back, the anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak. But as I stood there, I realized something had changed. The pain that had once been so sharp, so all-consuming, had dulled. The anger that had driven me to seek revenge had faded into something more like acceptance. What was done, and no amount of anger or regret could change that. I had spent so much time trying to destroy what had hurt me, trying to erase the pain, but in the end, all I had done was prolong it. It was time to let go. I sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath, and let the memories wash over me. I thought about Claire, about the woman she had been when we first met, and the woman she had become. I thought about our life together, the good times and the bad, and how it had all led to this moment. And then, I thought about what lay ahead, about the future I could build for myself and my children. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. The past was behind me, and while it had shaped me, it didn't have to define me. I had made mistakes, but I had also taken steps to protect myself and my kids, to move forward in a way that was healthy and right. The divorce had been a painful but necessary step, and now it was time to focus on what came next. I thought about the apartment I had moved into, about the empty walls and the sparse furniture. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I could make it a home, a place where Emma and Jack could feel safe and loved, where I could start rebuilding my life. I thought about my job, about the possibilities of moving up, of taking on new challenges. And I thought about the friends I had neglected during the chaos of the last few months, about reconnecting with them, about finding joy in the simple things again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that. There would be hard days, lonely days, days when the weight of everything would feel like too much to bear. But I also knew that I was stronger than I had been before, that I had the strength to keep moving forward, to keep building a life that was worth living. As I sat there, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would do better, not just for me, but for my kids. I would be the father they deserved, the man they could look up to, even in the midst of everything that had happened. I would show them that life goes on, that love is still possible, that happiness can be found even in the darkest of times. When I finally left the park, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I drove back to my apartment, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. I knew that there would be challenges ahead, but I also knew that I was ready to face them, that I was ready to start living again. The next morning, I woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the curtains of my new bedroom. I made a cup of coffee and sat at the small table in the kitchen, staring out the window at the world waking up around me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the familiar pang of sadness when I thought about the day ahead. Instead, I felt something else: hope. Later that day, I picked up Emma and Jack for the weekend. We spent the day exploring the neighborhood, finding a new park to play in, and laughing as we tried out a new pizza place down the street. It was a simple day, but it was perfect in its simplicity. The kids were happy, and for the first time in a long time, so was I. As the sun set and the kids settled into their new rooms, I sat on the couch, flipping through the photos on my phone. The photos of Claire and Greg were still there, buried deep in my camera roll, but I didn't feel the need to look at them anymore. Instead, I focused on the photos I had taken that day: Emma on the swing, Jack running through the grass, both of them smiling, carefree. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that I wasn't walking it alone. I had my kids, my friends, and most importantly, I had myself. I had come through the fire, and while I was still scarred, I was stronger for it. The pain of the past was real, but it didn't have to define my future. The next few months were a time of rebuilding, of rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage, outside of the anger and the pain. I reconnected with old friends, took up new hobbies, and focused on being the best father I could be. Claire and I managed to establish a new normal, co-parenting the best we could for the sake of the kids. We kept things civil, but distant. The love that had once been between us was gone, replaced by a quiet, mutual understanding that we were both better off apart. And slowly, I began to find peace. The empty apartment became a home, filled with the sounds of laughter and the warmth of new memories. The anger that had once driven me faded, replaced by a sense of acceptance. Life was different, but it wasn't over. There were still good things to come, still happiness to be found. One day, as I sat in the park with Emma and Jack, watching them play in the autumn leaves, I realized that I had finally come to terms with everything that had happened. The betrayal, the divorce, the heartbreak, it was all part of my story, but it didn't have to be the end of it. There was still so much life left to live, and I was ready to embrace it. As I watched my children laughing and playing, I felt a smile tug at the corners of my lips. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibilities. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to face whatever came next, to build a new life, not just for myself, but for the people I loved most. And that was enough.